and hello and welcome to Indaba where knowledge grows. Oh, folks, you're in for a really very good show tonight. Now, this program seeks to find consensus on issues which affect African lives here in Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean, and across the African diaspora. The program is hosted by the Emancipation Support Committee and is coming to you live from Talk City Studios here at 11A Marval Road. We begin today's program and we're going to be dealing with all sorts of different things. One of them that is pretty hot right now is the Trinity College Mocha Hair issue. And there's much, much more. So I'm going to bring in everyone at this moment. Let's see if I can get them up here. Hello and good evening.
Hello and good evening to you. Here's hoping that we have a wonderful program. Thank you so very much for your very dynamic and exciting introduction. Always a pleasure to be in the company of my activist extraordinaire brother. Is a title that I used last week. If it's not broke, we are not going to fix it. Tonight, as per the advice of Sister Karen, we have quite a show ahead of us. We are going to start certainly with the issue of Africa negotiating neutrality in the Ukraine-Russia war. We are certainly going to speak to next the issue of hair discrimination, or what seems to be alleged, reported, all of those safe non-suit words coming out of one of our local colleges in North Trinidad, the Mocha story, the crown issue, the hair issue, giving rise once again, all puns intended. Following that, we're going to hear in the Africa report from, of course, our very illustrious local resident historian, Dr. Claudius Fergus, on the matter of course, African politics as it speaks to currency and other related economic issues. And then last but not least on tonight, we'll be touching on a preview of things to come in terms of not just the matter of our Kwame Ture lecture series, which was kicked off certainly last week. Rastafari would tell me, no, it wasn't last week, it was first week, and I stand corrected, Rastafari, but it continues certainly on tomorrow, and getting some more information concerning that. And yet again, we have another dynamic installment of Viewpoint, and Brother Shabaka is going to be leading out on that issue as we talk about rulers within the Ghanaian context. What is the name of a Ghanaian Ashanti ruler? What is that name? What stool does he sit on? What is the history and the context behind that? All of these and more we'll be looking into on tonight. But to get the show started, I want to call upon Renee now to play a very controversial clip. It's coming from RT Russia TV, and it is exposing some of the European, as it were, racism that was voiced not just by people on the street, which we are accustomed to, but by politicians on the media. They seem to not be shy at all about their racism. So, Renee, if you can go ahead and play that clip, we'll be grateful. And at the back end of that, we'll go into the real reason why they were there and not the fake reason that was alleged by the Ukrainian politician. Over to you, Rene.
Days ago with African presidents that went to Ukraine and Russia, hoping to achieve a peace agreement between the two countries. A lot of things have happened, and I'd like us to look at this very interesting view of Mikhailo Podolyak, who is a Ukrainian politician. He's made a very interesting, spicy comment. He said, African leaders have no power and capacity or competence to resolve this crisis. African leaders have no power, capacity, or competence to resolve this crisis. So they are only doing this for geopolitical goals, including receiving resources from Russia and primitive information gathering on behalf of the Kremlin. Doesn't sound good. So we're going to listen to him from the horse's mouth. I'll make a comment right after. Let's go.
Ukraine says African states don't have the power or the capability to resolve the conflict, saying that they're only using the visits for their own geopolitical goals.
The African delegation had no goal for settling the conflict or finding a solution. Obviously, this is not their task. It's not on their level or their competency.
It's not on their level or their not on their level. Level? Did he say level? Wow. What level are you on?
They just want to be on the information agenda and resolve their own issues, like increasing the amount of resources they receive primarily from Russia, including food supplies.
So we are poor, we're looking for food.
They had to do was that information task in favor of Russia, by saying they don't see any missile in the air, that it all was an abstraction, a fabrication. This was a primitive attempt to win at information warfare.
Earlier, we spoke to geopolitical analyst Joe Malanga, who suggested why Kiev continues to reject various peace plans, whether they come from Africa, China, or even the Pope.
John Kirby in Pentagon said, we are not in favor of peace. We are not in favor of any ceasefire that should be happening in Ukraine. So that is a senior spokesperson for Pentagon. They don't want anything that is got to do with peace as far as Russia is concerned. The West was saying, this is what we've been waiting for. We've been pumping money. We've been pumping the military hardware to benefit the military industrial complex. So it's got nothing to do with Ukraine. Everything is got to do with what Washington, London, Brussels, whatever that they want to achieve. But it's not necessarily helping the actual citizens of Ukraine. That's the unfortunate part about this conflict.
Unbelievable. I'm going to have to play this guy again. I really want you to listen to him. This guy said this is not at African president level.
It's not on their level or their competency.
Level? It's not at their level? Not at their level? So what level are we on? I mean, do you remember that video of that guy? The video of the American security and intelligence personnel who say that Poland is the most racist country in Europe, just second to Ukraine.
Poland is one of the most racist nations on the planet. The most racist people in Europe, second only the Ukrainians.
Do you remember that? Do you hear this guy say? He doesn't even hide it. It's not at their level. So they're just trying to gain resources, including food. So you just came here to look for food. I mean, because you know Africa is a poor continent. People just die of food. We don't have food. We sleep hungry. We wear clothes from branches and leaves. We don't have clothes. We don't have internet. We walk on horses and not even horses, elephants. There's no running water here. There's no meat. So we have to go to Russia to get some food. And this is not at their level. Let's play this game.
The African delegation had no goal for settling the conflict or finding a solution. Obviously, this is not their task. It's not on their level or their competency.
This is not their task. It's not at their level or their competency. Their brain is not good enough to resolve this. It's not at their level. It's not their task.
They just want to be on the information.
They just want to be on the information. Because they don't have informations and channels in their countries. They need to come here so they can be broadcast all over the world.
Agenda and resolve their own issues, like increasing the amount of resources they receive primarily from Russia, including food supplies.
They're looking to get resources they get from Russia, including food supply. So do you guys get food supply from Russia? I didn't know that.
The most important thing that they had to do was that information task in favor of Russia, by saying they don't see any missile in the air, that it all was an abstraction, a fabrication. This was a primitive attempt to win at information warfare.
A primitive attempt to win at information warfare. Look how he's pulling his face. This is a primitive attempt to win at the information warfare. This is it's like you're smelling. Just talking about your subject is like you are smelling. This is a primitive attempt to win an information war. Primitive, not even an attempt. A primitive attempt. Oh, my man. I mean, love yourself, brothers. Put yourself first. That's what I'm going to say. Put yourself first. And again, if people don't call you to go resolve the issues, you mustn't go try and do it. I can understand if they went there for some other reasons, but if you went there to resolve their issue, I think that wasn't a good choice. And like they said very clearly, this is beyond Kiev decision. It's not within the hands of Ukrainians anymore. This has everything to do with the Western countries. They're going to choose when the war ends, when their goals are achieved. This has nothing to do with Ukraine anymore. well beyond them. And it's very sad. Like I said again, you need to open your eyes. When somebody shows you what color he is, don't try to paint him a different color. I show you that I'm color red. Don't paint me white. No, don't do that. I already showed you. Okay, listen to how people talk about you. I mean, look at the attitude with which the presidents of Africa were received in Ukraine. Just look at the attitude. I'm just saying. Just look at the way. Just compare the way they were in Russia. And I have no sympathy with Russia. Absolutely not. Like, what have Russia done for me? Nothing. We're just talking clearly. Look at the way they were received in Russia compared to the way they were in Ukraine. You could see like, why are you here? It's like somebody had to say, you know what? Just let them be. They're going to be here for a few hours. They'll go. Don't chase them. Just let them be. They're like, you are unwanted. Look, just look. Now, this guy just comes and confirms. You think this guy would speak like this out of nothing if they've never had a meeting or discussion or anything of that sort within themselves? Just remember what happens. I mean, if you want to know what's going to happen in the future, look at the past. It's as simple as that. When the war started, they refused Africans to leave Ukraine. They refused them to leave, to get in the trains. They said to them, women and children first. In the meantime, some women presented themselves pregnant. They refused them to get on the train. They're not telling you this is a primitive attempt to win information war. This is beyond your level. It's not on your level. This is not on your level. You're looking for publicity. You want to be on the information. Because wherever you are, you don't have news channels and stuff like that. You don't even have access to YouTube or wherever. You need to come here, come next to us so you can be on the information. This has nothing to do with you. I'm telling it like it is, brother. Can you see? I'm not inventing anything. Look at this guy's face, the way he's talking. Look at how he's talking. It's very sad. Love yourself, fellas. Stop treating people the way they don't treat you. Stop doing that. Stop giving people honors and all that accolade and receiving and accepting people the way we always do. While in the meantime, look how we treated in India. Look how our people are treated in Lebanon. Look at how our people are treated in the United States of America by police. Stop closing your eyes. Stop blinding yourself to the reality. And it's very sad the same president went to Europe, in France, go cry Charlie Hebdo went in the meantime, in Africa, many wars, many situations are happening. We have not seen this president go and walk and try to find peace agreement. Good for you. Primitive attempt for peace.
Yes, a mouthful indeed there. I'm not sure where our viewers or even where we would land in terms of all that he has said. He said a mouthful. But one of the things that I can certainly agree with is that with regards to Poland and Ukraine, they are certainly a safe haven for neo-Nazis who are operating with great impunity in those nations. And we've seen all kinds of hostilities against our people there. But by way of clearing the air, it would be very important for me to identify what the actual 10 points were. And further to doing that, I'll call upon my activist extraordinaire to weigh in on the issue. Among other things, they wanted one, that the African delegation be listened to, and also that of course, they too would in turn listen to both Russia and Ukraine and their various perspectives in relation to the war. So they wanted to create an environment where everyone was operating on equal footing, giving a lending ear to each other to truly understand what's happening. Again, Rastafari would correct me and say overstand. Point number 2, the war must be settled and ended with negotiations, which is to say that we can't fight our way to the end of this war. It has to be settled by way of diplomatic means and not through ceaseless hostilities. There must be an end to war. Direct quote from the president of South Africa: the war cannot go on forever. Point number 3, a de-escalation of conflict on both sides. Even though you don't bring an end to the war itself altogether, at the very least you can de-escalate, you can bring an end to certain types of hostilities so that you are not being seen as a perpetual aggressor. Point number 4, that Africa recognizes the country's sovereignty and believes all parties should work in terms of internationally recognized principles. So they are calling for one, the recognition of their sovereignty on the one hand, but on the other hand, by way of diplomatic reasoning, they are saying there's an international model, there is an international benchmark, they recognize principles of war, international recognized principles of jurisdiction. Let's abide by those. Next point, there should, as it were, be a need. Let me say that again. There needs to be security guarantees. There's a need for security guarantees within this conflict. Next point, there's a call for an opening up of movement of grains shipment from the Black Sea into Africa. Of course, this is a talking point that was used by the Ukrainian politician to say that Africa is going there to beg for food. Africa is purchasing these grains out of Ukraine, purchasing the fuel and fertilizers out of Russia. This is not handouts, this is not charity, but they are saying because of the war, fuel prices, fertilizer prices, and certainly grain prices are escalating. And we need to have shipments be allowed to be traversed through the Black Sea, without which we will continue to suffer as a continent. Not that we are depending on your handouts, but we absolutely need those shipments to continue. I would say this in passing, really briefly, that Africa needs to get to a place and position where she's self-sufficient in the area of grain. And I would land there. The next point would be grant humanitarian aid to all those suffering because of the conflict. This war has caused great suffering. There are many, many refugees that have been displaced, many people that have been displaced, many lives upended. There needs to be humanitarian aid grants from these countries. Next point, free all prisoners of war on both sides. That is very in keeping with international best practices in relation to the matter. Repatriate all children displaced by the war. Penultimately, there should be post-war reconstruction. Of course, you have to rebuild hospitals and rebuild clinics and rebuild sidewalks and rebuild whatever was destroyed in the hostilities. And last but not least, before I invite my brother in, further negotiations to end the war with Africa contributing to the process, because they are seeing Africa as potential soldiers on both sides of the war, especially with regards to Ukraine. They've been trying to recruit African soldiers, but they don't want Africa to have an input with regards to settling this dispute. I'd land there and I'd turn over to my very erudite brother for comment.
Yes, my brother. Well, first of all, let's just be clear that the stories that come from our people from Poland, from Ukraine, and from Russia indicate that there's racism in challenges with race in all those countries, serious challenges. So Russia, we as the African our position. Or the African continent's position, the position of African leadership is one of neutrality, and I want to support that position and not to take any particular side in this issue. And let's be clear, when it comes to the way our people are treated in those countries, we have a lot to deal with. And I'm not just saying Ukraine and Poland now, but Russia as well. There's a whole rising neo-Nazi movement across Europe. And of course, Ukraine is one of those countries at the center of it. We talked about that right here on Indaba on another program. And of course, Ukraine came to our attention in terms of the way they treated people who were trying to leave. They differentiated between those who were of African descent and other colored people of color from different parts of the world, and Europeans, in terms of how people were being treated when they were trying to cross the border to flee from that war when it was just beginning. And of course, there are horror stories of African students, and in fact, I think they had to put together a team of lawyers and so on the continent of Africa to go into Ukraine to try to help our people there because of the extent of the racism. So let's make all these things clear. And
I
of
want to
course,
ask a question real quick before we segue because I know that we have another segment for tonight in the first half, and it has to do with Russia's historic role as a liberator and an ally in Africa. It's no secret that within Zimbabwe, and Angola and other territories, that Russian forces, with actually the very presence of Vladimir Putin himself, the president of Russia, being on boots on the ground as part of an allyship. Fighting against Western powers. While I am hearing what you're saying on tonight, in terms of anti African hostilities by all three of those nations. At no point was Poland, at no point was Ukraine ever on the ground as part of a freedom fighter initiative in Africa,
well,
as Russia has been. So, with regards to that, do you think that that certain African nations may feel a bit beholden to Russia, and specifically South Africa, because South Africa is part of the BRICS nation, and they are calling upon South Africa to arrest, as it were, Putin when he lands in the summit, if he goes to the next BRICS summit, which is going to be held in South Africa. Can you arrest your allies and those who've been historically siding with you against Western aggressions and hostilities? I know it's a big question to end with, but doesn't that compromise Africa's neutrality? We know what they're saying, but the reality is there's a lived experience, and can that not influence their position?
yes, well, of course, that history is important, and I'm certain that that is part of, it is the thing that is central to the way that African countries are treating with this matter. Because, and of course, just to clarify for our listeners, our countries were recently, up until very recently, colonized by Western European powers. And starting in the 1960s, our people, as during that, from about the 1950s, 60s, when our people sought their independence, it was the Russians at the time, the Soviet Union, that supported a number of those key fronts, those military attempts by our people to liberate themselves from under Western European powers, not just in South Africa under apartheid, but in Zimbabwe, against the settler Rhodesian government in the 60s until independence in 1980. In Angola, they supported the Movimento Popular de Libertação de Angola, the MPLA, from the 60s until independence from Portugal in 1975. So that history is something, in Africa, they say the worst crime you can commit is to be ungrateful. So I'm sure that history is a huge factor in the way that African governments view the conflict right now and their neutral stance.
Of course, South Africa belongs to the ICJ, and it is the ICJ that is calling upon them to arrest Vladimir Putin for war crimes. And it finds itself among the BRICS nations. Of course, the S in BRICS is South Africa. There are many nations, some 19 nations that are applying to not to South Africa, but to BRICS for inclusion in what seems to be a counter, not just narrative, but counterposition to Western hegemony, with China, again, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa being featured there. So South Africa is really caught between a rock and a hard place. We see France asking to have a seat within the BRICS nations. Many see them as a Trojan horse. Many see them as really a spy trying to get into that network, in light of all that France has said and done over the years, the current hostilities. We expose the neo-colonization that is taking place in West Africa by France. So France is asking for a seat on the table. South Africa is placed between BRICS and ICJ. If you were a betting man, where do you think this is going to land? Do you think that he's going to maintain his BRICS solidarity, or do you think that he is going to land on the side of the ICJ?
Well, I think the South African state, from the top right down to civil society, has pronounced on the matter, and they will not arrest Putin, or they've stated very clearly that they will not be part of that during the BRICS meeting. So I don't think we need to do any guessing.
Well, I am certainly with you now. We were looking forward to hearing from some young men at Trinity College, which is the second feature of the first half, speaking to hear issues that has
Yeah.
been part of a national embroidery of sorts in most recent days. Let's speak to the issue. We are hoping to have them join us, but for the sake of the listenership, can you elucidate on the matter? Can you speak to the details coming out of the college in terms of the real and perceived discriminations, again having to do with natural African appearance, in this case, the hairstyle?
Yeah. Okay. So we are about to say goodbye to our radio listenership for the Lotto for a few minutes, and they will return with us shortly. So in the meantime, we can discuss the issue to some extent for our listenership on Facebook and YouTube. So let's start off by just saying that this is a real issue. We don't have all the details yet. We've only gotten on to students who were part of the issue in the 5 or 10 minutes before this radio show began. We've interviewed teachers, we've interviewed other parties, but it's important to get the view of the students before we jump to any conclusions. And of course, they will be given their view for the first time tonight, if all works well, on this radio show in Daba, which is always a place where a lot of important stories break. But having said that, we are faced across the Caribbean, not just here in Trinidad and Tobago, with a hair issue. Uh, we have come to a point, a kind of crossroads, where young people, women, for example, or young women have reached a point where they understand the dangers of the chemicals involved in processing their hair. And not only that, but they just no longer feel the need. They have reached a point in their own decolonization process where they no longer feel the need to pay homage to white beauty standards, within their own community and even outside of their community, to be appreciated. And so, between that growing sense of their own self and their own beauty, and that sense and that understanding that the chemicals involved in the alteration process to look European, to fit into European beauty standards, are dangerous. And we've gone into detail here on Indaba in terms of what those dangers
Absolutely.
are. Um, there's a growing consensus now. I mean, you can see it if you go to young people, young women below a particular age, in their teenage years now. You'll be hard pressed to find somebody with processed hair. Whereas when I was growing up, it was a ritual. At 9 years old, between 9 and 11, girls had to have their hair processed. You never saw a mother. Many children grew up, spent their whole lives not knowing what their mother's hair looked like, because they would have come into this world with their mother with processed hair, and perhaps even wearing wigs up until she passed away. And so they never got a chance to see their mother's natural hair. That's the condition that colonialism left us in. And again, I talk about the women, but the young men we had here on Indaba going back in 2019, we would have interviewed mothers of young men and some students, a young girl and a young boy. One of them was actually from Trinity College, right here on Indaba, who talked about the experience of going to school and being discriminated against. Just 2 weeks ago, you will recall, Kwame, that we interviewed the two young men who were outstanding students, honored for their outstanding academic performance at Howard. And those two young men, when we asked them about discrimination in the United States of America, they told us that they had experienced more discrimination here in Trinidad and Tobago than they had experienced since they had gone to live in the
Indeed, they
United States
did.
of America to study. And when we pressed them to find out what that looked like, the issue that they raised was the issue of hair discrimination. So the young student who who was of Indian descent, he pointed out that he had to stand up on a number of occasions for his African colleagues at school and to argue that his hair was longer than theirs and they should not be made to cut their hair, they should not be punished and so on for that hair. So let me just welcome back our listeners on 91.1 and just quickly bring them into the conversation. We have started talking about the hair issue, which took over the national imagination today in Trinidad and Tobago as people awoke to this, to the understanding that there was some kind of issue at the graduation of students from Mocha, Trinity and Mocha. And what we're saying is that this is a real issue. For those of you who are just joining us, in 2019, we actually wrote the Caribbean Freedom Project in collaboration with the Emancipation Support Committee. If you go back to the newspapers from that period, you'll see there's an article that says, this here issue has not been resolved. We were responding to Franklin Can and the Minister Garcia at the time, who both felt that once they had resolved the issue with the young lady at the time, Kalika Morton, who was the daughter of a famous West Indies cricketer who had passed away. Once they had resolved that issue, and that issue, as far as we understood, wasn't even resolved, but once they had resolved that issue, there should be no further conversation. You will recall that in that year, the former chairman of the Emancipation Support Committee, Kafra Cambon, wrote a note to the Ministry of Education calling on them to set up a committee to look into the matter and to find some resolution for the nation. And of course, none of those issues were taken up. And so here we are again. And if this time it is not addressed properly, we will be back here again in a few months' time talking about kids. Now, what makes this particular period different? And as I said, when we talk to these young people, you'll see they have reached a point in their own development where they no longer feel the need to pay homage to European beauty standards. It's done. It's finished. That period of epistemic colonial violence has run its course. Where those younger generations are concerned, they didn't grow up like we did, Kwame, with with those images that we had to deal with on TV. There were no African images, and if they were, even the men had conked hair. We didn't have. They have not digested, as Leroy Clark would put it, all that hot molten bronze, and so they are in a better position than we were when we were their age. They've accepted themselves. They love themselves. They are aware of the dangers of chemical processing, and there's a natural hair movement like you've never seen, like only Daga and Winston and Kafra and those guys from 1970 they would dream about back in the 1970s, and so that is coming to clash with the schools which want to maintain traditional colonial standards. And that's where we come in now as the activist community. We have to make sure that this matter, this time, is resolved in such a way that it never happens again. As I said, this is not a Trinidadian problem. This is a Caribbean problem.
Absolutely. I think that might be all the time we have for now in this segment. We may have to move on at this point, and so we call upon Renee from the technical staff to take us into our Africa report tonight. There's so much more ahead. Please stay tuned. But as at this time, we want to move into the Africa report brought by Dr. Claudius Fergus.
Many analysts would readily concede that America's global power derives from its vast military arsenal, but this is not the whole truth. Much more critical to the maintenance of U.S. imperialism is the global hegemony of its currency, the greenback. This is the Africa Report, and in this edition, we take a look at the burgeoning rebellion against the U.S. dollar, as well as the IMF and the World Bank, two of the major agencies through which the United States weaponizes its dollar. Currently, 88% of international trade is conducted in US dollars, which also account for some 55% of global foreign exchange reserves. Just imagine The central banks of major African producers of gold, like Ghana, South Africa, and Sudan, are compelled to keep US dollars as foreign reserves, while the US locks down African gold in Fort Knox. An extension of this situation is the compulsory use of U.S. banks as intermediaries in these countries' cross-border trade. This dependency makes these countries sitting ducks to unilateral sanctions by America, targeting and freezing accounts of governments, corporations, and significant individuals. The genesis of America's stranglehold on global finance could be traced back to the creation of the IMF and the World Bank after World War II. But the current stranglehold on global trade actually began much later, during the oil boom of the 1970s, when OPEC, the association of the largest oil-producing and exporting countries, was created, and the Middle Eastern oil giants began flexing their financial muscles over the West. Let's hear more on this from Ben Norton, courtesy the Geopolitical Economy Report of 7th of June.
Saudi Arabia has been one of the key players in maintaining the petrodollar system since an agreement was signed in 1974 between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Riyadh agreed to sell all of its oil in dollars, and this helped maintain an international demand for dollars after the U.S. government under Richard Nixon removed the dollar from its link to gold in 1971, and the U.S. dollar became a freely floating fiat currency. So in order to maintain global demand for the dollar, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell its oil in dollars, which, being the world's largest oil producer at the time and the de facto leader of OPEC, the oil-producing organization, this meant that many countries around the world that needed to import oil needed to get access to dollars, maintaining this artificial demand, which is what has allowed the United States for decades, among other factors, to maintain a massive trade deficit with the rest of the world, a current account deficit, so the U.S. can suck in the surplus value of other countries and import much more than it exports without facing inflation and the devaluation of its currency.
The African Union should have had its own common currency many decades ago. The idea was first proposed by Ghana's visionary founding father, President Kwame Nkrumah, back in 1963, 60 years ago. Listen to Kenyan Professor PLO Lumumba remind us of this missed opportunity.
But the most passionate speech again was that of Kwame Nkrumah. He tells them, let us not live here without one government, without one army, without one currency.
The first serious effort to develop a viable Pan-African financial institution was the creation of the Afrexim Bank in 1993 to finance and promote intra- and extra-African trade. The bank is critical for the success of the recently launched African Continental Free Trade Agreement, AFCFTA. Currently, 51 countries of the AU are members of Afrexim Bank. But the AU does not have a common currency, which means Afrexim Bank dispenses foreign currencies, mainly US dollars and the euro. Some African countries try to escape this catch-22 situation by adopting cryptocurrency. But recently, there have been strident calls for more aggressive action to eliminate this absurdity. Kenyan President William Ruto is one of the leading advocates for immediate action. Here is Ruto addressing a summit of the African Private Sector Dialogue and the Council of Ministers of the AFCFTA earlier this month.
And our traders are struggling to make payments for goods and services from one country to another because of differences in currencies. And in the middle of all this, we are all subjected to a dollar environment. Kenyans want to pay for Tanzanian goods in dollars. Tanzania wants to pay for DRC goods in dollars. Egypt wants to pay. Why are we bringing dollars in the middle of our trade?
Another developing option in Africa's international trade is payment in non-Western currencies. Egypt has already taken steps to settle trade with Russia in rubles. trade with China in yuan, and trade with India in rupee. The most promising option to subdue the US dollar is the soon-to-be-launched BRICS currency. BRICS, BRICS, is the acronym for a trading alliance comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRIC was formed in 2006 with the first 4 countries and expanded to the BRICS in 2010 with the inclusion of South Africa. With over 20 new applications for membership, BRICS could soon become BRICS Plus. Within Africa, these countries include Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, Senegal, Sudan, Tunisia, and Zimbabwe. Among those outside of Africa, we have Argentina, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Turkey, Uruguay, and Venezuela. The BRICS alliance commands the attention of the Western industrialized nations for good reasons. Their economies collectively stand at over 26 trillion US dollars. They account for well over 3 billion people, or 2/5 of the world's population. The last round of US sanctions for the Ukraine-Russia war was the last straw in speeding up the drive for a new BRICS international currency, the launch of which could be announced at the group summit in Johannesburg, South Africa this August. This prospect has alerted Western powers to the serious threat the BRICS poses to its stranglehold on the international trade, international finance, and global diplomacy. On its edition of the 25th of June, the iconic Fortune magazine headlined the following caption: "How long will the dollar last as the world's default currency? The BRICS nations are gathering in South Africa this August with it on the agenda." And that's only one of the many screaming headlines in print and breaking news in other media in America and Europe in recent times. Interestingly, France has also ditched the US dollar for trade with China, paying in yuan. Perhaps more interestingly, President Macron has expressed an interest in attending the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg in August. Some see Macron as a Trojan horse, but it could well be a whole Trojan cavalry. It is also known that Belarus has shown interest in BRICS, as well as other unnamed European countries. Perhaps out of national interest only, perhaps as a proxy of Western financial institutions to preempt outcomes in Johannesburg, Macron hosted a summit last weekend at which several African leaders attended. We could expect more similar counter strategies by the leadership of the Global Supremacist League of Nations. Meantime, while Africans await the BRICS Bank, Afreximbank is forging ahead with local financial instruments to circumvent the inherited colonized payment system. Let's close with William Ruto at the same forum.
I am, however, delighted to note that Afreximbank, in its mandate to facilitate intra-Africa and extra-Africa trade, embarked on building a centralized payment and settlement system to support trade under the ACFTA. It is called the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. Banks and payment providers can plug directly to it to enable secure and instant payment in local currency.
Yes, it seems that we are dealing with some serious international relations tonight on Indaba. Thank you, Dr. Fergus, for that report there, and a lot to chew on there. Let me just quickly announce that tomorrow the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series continues with the one and only Dr. James Small. And of course, for
Indeed.
those of you who don't know, he was with us here on Indaba a few weeks ago when, or not a few, couple months ago, when the issue of Malcolm X's family suing New York and other entities for the the way that his death was handled. When Benjamin Crump, the attorney Benjamin Crump, took up their issue, we invited Dr. Small to join us here on Indaba.
Powerful interview indeed.
He was the person who took over Malcolm X's mosque after Malcolm passed away. He would have known Brother Malcolm and been around in that period, and he was able to shed some light on that matter in most remarkable. Anybody who missed that interview really missed out. People spoke about that interview for weeks, and so we know the kind of in heavy brother we're talking about here. He is part of a group of Pan-Africanists that, starting in the 90s or late 80s, would have started really building and bridging and building links with West African countries and with Egypt in particular. They all had their, they all sat at the feet of the Pharaoh of African Studies, the great Dr. Ben Buchanan, and so they would have conducted tours and so on and brought many African people from the diaspora right across the Caribbean, even here in Trinidad and Tobago, would have joined them on these pilgrimages back to the continent of Africa, to West Africa, and to Egypt in particular. And so this man with this wealth of information, wealth of knowledge, who is really a scholar across religions as well. I don't know if you know that about Small. He is an absolute scholar of the Bible, a scholar of the Quran, and other and traditional African religion as well. So he brings really a depth to any discussion that is quite impressive. So he's going to be with us tomorrow at 5 p.m. Looking at the challenges that Africa faces in 21st century. So we really look forward to that. We invite you to join the Emancipation Support Committee's Facebook page, YouTube channel, to be there for that virtual presentation by Dr. James Small. And now going back to our issue, it seems to me that we are the actual, not the ceremony, but the party, the graduation event is tonight for those Trinity boys. And so what we were asking them to do was to leave their graduation event, that party, and join us here on Indaba. And I think that challenge might have been just a bit too much for them. Perhaps they have not been able to get together because we only invited them literally 5 to 10 minutes before the show. They didn't have a chance to confirm properly. But we will have them on next week for sure, and we will interview them for the articles that we will write to the press on this matter. But the minister has waded in, Reverend Kwame, and I just had her article in front of me. Yes, she is saying that she described the events as regrettable and unfortunate. Some of her comments are a little difficult to make sense of. But she says, regardless of one's emotional and visceral response to the issue, it is a fact that societal order depends on rule keeping, and that it is a critical facet of the education schools are meant to impart. No matter how non-conformist one's outlook, we all follow some rule or the other. Therefore, the practice of adherence to school rules is important, and where there are divergent views, dialogue rather than open confrontation should be encouraged, especially in a school setting. These are the comments. She goes on to say, she goes on to announce plans to initiate conversations surrounding the removal of subjectivity regarding school hairstyles, adding that decisions arising out of these talks will be implemented in the upcoming academic year. So she's not, I don't think these statements go far enough. I think there has to be, coming from the authorities, an immediate moratorium on all these types of activities that attempt to police African hair in schools. I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, Kwame, but an immediate moratorium while all the stakeholders involved are invited to discuss the issue and bring the knowledge and information they have to the table. And until such a process reaches a conclusion, there must be no place for any individual teacher or any collective institution to impose its own subjectivity on students of African descent in particular.
I have to concur. I think you were absolutely prophetic, as was the Emancipation Support Committee and the Crossroads Freedom Project in prophesying. So I guess I'm not the only cleric here that the hair issue was not, as at that time, settled. Dealing with one particular issue and resolving one particular student's problem does not a policy position make. And so there is a need for a commission, there is a need for a council to meet on this issue, representing all of the various views on the matter, of course, inclusive of that of African civil society, more especially than any other voice. To weigh in on all of the issues. The problem with Trinidad and Tobago and many of the former colonies is that we are working with a model not just of Eurocentric beauty standards, but sometimes what we would call Pauline beauty standards. I wouldn't even say biblical beauty standards because David had long hair, so too did Solomon, so too did many of the kings of Israel. And so dreadlocks was seen. I'm not sure how many people know, but there was a war against Israel in a region called Lachish. And when that war was waged against Israel, those who went to war against Israel would have taken, as it were, artisans with them to portray them in terms of their phenotype and their personage to chronicle the war. They didn't have video cameras and camcorders at that time. There was no 4K technology. There was none of that. And so they took these artisans, and what you had coming out of Israel as portrayed by these artisans were persons with afros, as in Africans wearing afros with beards, much like yours and mine here today. But beyond the bearded men with afros, kinky, coily hair, afros, they also portrayed dreadlocks as well among the captives and among those that they threw over rooftops to their death. But Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14 says, "Will it not even nature itself teach you," KJV version, "that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him?" And that became, as it were, the European standard for quite a while. And as a result of that, it was, imported into our colonies and made again a standard. But that's a Pauline fringe view that has made its way into national policy, and I would like to see an end to that. As a cleric and like Professor James Small, I'm certainly not in his pedigree, but as a student of comparative studies and comparative religion, I can tell you most assuredly that most indigenous tribes and communities identify the spiritual connection, as it were, with the gods, with the Elohim, with the Orishas, with that of the antenna that is the hair. And
Yeah,
so
well,
to
Kwame, Brother Reverend, I'm glad that you bring that perspective to the table. But let me just say right off the bat, from a secular point of view, that by regulating the hairstyles that are suitable for African children, or vastly more popular among African descendant people than any other group, as part of a supposedly neutral dress code, schools are getting away with violating the civil rights of our children without any repercussions.
I concur. I concur 1000%. And so to
It
land, I will
is
say to you that
unacceptable.
because I understand, overstand Rastafari would correct me in saying the biblical position that they are trying to use as their neutral center point, I just rubbished that by way of biblical history. So I'm saying I am erasing, as it were, even their spiritual reasons that they would have held on to in the colonial past. And so, by way of the secular republic that we find ourselves in to engage in that level of stigma and discrimination, there's absolutely no reason for it. And I stand with the students, and I stand with the Emancipation Support Committee and Crossroads Freedom Project and everybody that has a mind and a will of righteousness to say this is discrimination and it must stop. And it needs a clear policy position, not just the allowance of any one person or two persons to sport what they would call an exception to the rule. It must be the rule that you can wear your hair in any Afro natural style that it is most suited to. And
But we
that's
have somebody, sorry, we have somebody from Talk City, a caller who is trying to get in. Karen, if that person is still online, or if you have another caller, please let them in. We can't hear you, but perhaps the administration could make sure that the call comes through. Before we lose our listenership on 91.1, let me just say that this year for Emancipation, something special is going to happen. The visit of the Asante Hena of the Ashanti people is a huge deal. This is the perhaps for after the visit of Haile Selassie back in the 1960s. This is the largest, this is the most important African royalty to visit Trinidad and Tobago. So, let me see if you have okay, so
Hello, can you hear me?
yes, Karen.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so they were just on, they just hung up. Oh wait, they're on now. Hold on.
Yes.
Let's see if we can bring them in.
Greetings.
Yes.
Hello.
Brother.
greetings.
Yeah, greetings. This is Balagoon.
Yes,
At
brother.
1970 to now, this system supposed to change because under the previous regime gone by, the Commissioner of Police, Anthony May, tried to take off people's dreadlocks from them. I want to ask them who they feel the Maasai tribe was in Africa. The Maasai tribe, their hairstyle was the original. What it is they're trying to do with our children in the classroom and in this system of Trinidad and Tobago. I will rise up. I have to put a placard at the Trinity College. I must demonstrate, and I call on Africans in the diaspora to stand up and make their voices be heard. I call on the Rastafarian movement to listen to these little children's plight, listen to their cries, because it's going to be something different if they don't take heed of what is going on with the African today in this society. We Africans must stand up. We must stand up and fight because we have nothing to lose, You see the disrespect in the classroom, in the school curriculum. We don't have a language. We don't have a culture. And the Minister of Education is making a statement like that. I want the African diaspora around the world to stand up, because look what's happening in Sudan. Arms being poured into Rwanda to America, with America pointing and handing it.
Thank you, Brother Balagoon. I think that you, Brother Balagoon, actually makes a very interesting point there. Because if we try to engage this issue, let's say 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we would have been engaging this issue as a national community alone. But because times have changed so drastically, the entire world will be looking at us when we start the dialogue in Trinidad and Tobago. In the last 5 years,
Shabaka, I'm sorry. I'm going to be leaving you all, but this is amazing. So my listeners who want to continue, please join them on Could you just say?
Emancipation Support Committee's Facebook page and YouTube page.
There you go.
So those of you who have the access, please join us. And let me just say again that the entire world and the new institutions that were built in the wake of George Floyd's death, like the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, all these institutions are going to be looking much more closely now at what happens in Trinidad and Tobago around this issue. This is no longer a place where a small community of elites who have a particular set of values that they've inherited from a particular colonial period can have their way without having to engage a global community of African people that is organized to ensure that we have our rights.
I couldn't agree with Balagun more. And I know you introduced the topic concerning the Ashanti royalty. You were paying such amazing homage to the significance of the office and the trip. Comparing it, of course, to that as of Imperial Majesty, as only second in position in terms of importance to that
Yeah,
very.
and that's not to take anything away from the Asante Hena, but when when Selassie came to the Caribbean, remember the historical context. He was victorious over the
Absolutely.
Italians, in that battle to maintain the
War hero.
sovereignty
Yes.
of the last bastion of uncolonized ground on the continent. Of course, we know there were a couple other places that were not colonized, but Ethiopia was that flagship where the people took a stand and were able to eventually come out on top. And he was, of course, that victory was projected onto him for his role as leader of that. And of course, he did that regally. And so he was, he represented all the hopes and aspirations of a people who had just come out of vicious, oppressive circumstances, or was still in bondage in a sense, and trying to come out of that bondage. Now, here we are in a post-independence period, on the next side of things, and we have the visit of the Asante Hena. Now, we've had African royalty here over the
Yes.
years coming for emancipation. I
Oni
remember
Avife.
a number of aristocrats in the Emancipation Festival. We've had presidents, etc., important leaders from the continent. But as I say, in terms of royalty, I think this nothing between Haile Selassie and the Asante Hena. I don't think there's anything to compare. And I think so. This is huge, and I think it's generating a lot of excitement across the country as people, not just from the Pan-African community, but from the business community, from who understands the importance of this particular figure in West Africa.
Let's talk about the relationship that we have as a diaspora with Africa and Ghana in particular. There was, of course, the declaration of the Year of Return, 2019, celebrating some 400 years since slavery in the Virginia colonies, which started in 1619. So 2019 would have marked 400 years. For those that follow biblical prophecy, there was a prophecy that says after 400 years that there would be, as it were, liberation, and there would be freedom, that there would be emancipation. And so Ghana took that and ran with it. There was the Year of Return. COVID-19 happened. And since then, there has even been legislation on the part of the Ghanaian government, which has created several tracks for diasporans to become citizens of Ghana, inclusive of genetic tracks by way of showing heritage, African heritage, by way of spending 3 to 5 years in Ghana as a resident, by way of doing business in Ghana.
There's a link between that discourse and the Emancipation Festival, which a lot of people may not be aware of.
Speak to it. Speak to it.
But if we go back to 2006, we had the visit of President Rawlings from Ghana.
Yes.
Emancipation.
Historic.
And at the village, he made that pledge having seen, he was so impressed by what he saw, the outpouring of Africans in their thousands onto the streets at that time to celebrate emancipation and the meaning and substance. He made that pledge to go back home and to do what he could to foster repatriation. And so he made it very easy for the time that he was in power for people from the diaspora to get dual citizenship. And of course, we could even go back further than that to the Kwame Nkrumah being, the first president of Ghana and one of the leading Pan-Africanists in the world. The man who said that you're African not because you're born in Africa, but because Africa is born in you.
Absolutely.
And of course, he would have taken those early measures to make Ghana friendly to the people of diaspora. Ghana is the place where W.E.B. Du Bois went to make his contribution, where George Padmore is honored in George Padmore with an eternal flame and a library and so on. That's Trinidadian from the East-West corridor, George Padmore. So Ghana has always been, open, stretching forth its hand in some form or fashion to the people of the diaspora. And it's, of course, one of those places where a lot of our ancestors came from. And, of course, in the years after Jerry Rawlings, you've had different versions of the initiatives that he took coming out of the Emancipation Celebration in Trinidad and Tobago, his visit to Trinidad and Tobago coming to the fore. And those kinds of overtures from Ghana continue up to today. So all those things, of course, add to the context which make people excited about having the Asante Hena here in Trinidad and Tobago for Emancipation 2023. And add a kind of it brings a kind of royal energy to the festival this year, to the commemoration of this historic moment this year.
Well, I can tell you most assuredly that my children are looking forward to it. My wife is looking forward to it. I am looking forward to it. My family, we usually show up in our numbers. Since I was, a child, since we were children, we were part of the festival. Literally grew up in the festival, much like yourself, doing karate, etc. I would not be going to do any katas or any techniques on the main stage. But I tell you most assuredly, we will be a part of the procession, and we do look forward to meeting and greeting with the African royalty. Not only for the pomp and the pageantry of it, not only for what it symbolizes in terms of Africans of worth and Africans of history and Africans of culture standing tall and standing proud in the 21st century context post George Floyd. Not only that, but certainly to remind us in the diaspora that while we are going through our struggles, as many and as varied as they may be, we are not going to go through them alone. That we, the diaspora, are going to continue to partner with our brothers and sisters, and in this case, kings and queens on the continent who see and recognize our value, see and recognize the kith and kin, see and recognize the mutual benefit to be had of coming together. And I know that I know that there's a buzz from all walks of life. Rastafari, the Hebrew Israelite community. I'm not sure if you know, but the Hebrew Israelite community is very, very, as it were, populous in Ghana because of certain cultural and spiritual connections between the Ashanti people, the Evevio people, and other tribes in Western Africa there, and of course ancient African Hebrew customs. So there's a lot of people, Orisha spiritual Baptists, coming out in their great numbers to pay homage and to again see a king in living color. I think that's an opportunity once in a lifetime, and certainly we are looking forward to it.
Yes, indeed. And of course, in the past, we hear stories about the African kings from that part of the continent. When they traveled with their entourage, they devalued the price of gold. The Ghanaians, that was once called the Gold Coast by the Europeans.
It was.
For a reason. And there's a real tradition of those Ghanaian kings have a real connection to that particular metal. So it's going to be interesting to see and meet and greet and learn more about the Asante Hina when he's here. Dr. Fergus has recently done a presentation for us on some of the history, and he's promised to come back again in perhaps next week, Wednesday, on the next edition of Indaba, to talk some more about the Golden Stool and the story of Ya Asante, the legendary African Ashanti leader who battled, who led the people in that last battle against the British or the Portuguese, the British in on behalf of the Ashanti people, who now occupy not just Ghana but at least two other countries outside very populous large community in West Africa. And so there's excitement, and we're going to keep you posted here on Indaba, where knowledge grows. On that note, my friends on Facebook and on YouTube, join us again next week, Wednesday. It's been a pleasure for myself, Shabaka Kambon, and my colleague, Reverend Kwame Kamau, to share this time with you tonight. And of course, we'll be here next week for the next edition. Good night.
Good night.